Students to this online lecture series on American drama. So far we have looked at Eugene O'Neill's The Hairy Ape, and we have continued with our classes on Arthur Miller's The Death of a Salesman. Today we will be looking at the characters that have been used in this play and looking at them, analyzing them and understanding them from different perspectives. We'll also look at the thematic concerns that the play deals with and the larger import that those themes have on our understanding of the play. And largely, we will also take a look at the different symbols or the idea of symbolism and the way in which it is utilized and in some sense enhances the depth and our understanding of the play. To begin with, the protagonist of Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman is Willy Loman. Now, Willy Loman is a character which is stuck in the past. It is a character which is in some sense Janus-faced, two-faced. One face is constantly looking over his shoulders and constantly yearning for the past and invariably changing it to suit the present, while the other face is constantly looking towards the future. A future which hopefully will be shaped by the actions in the present and the lies that Willy Loman fills his past with. Unfortunately, Willy Loman's obsession with a golden future and an impeccable past is what ruins his present. He is someone who is not able to somehow root himself in the present and come to terms with his demons, with the ghosts of his past. Willy, throughout the play, does not achieve the self-realization or the self-knowledge which is very typical of the tragic hero. In Oedipus Rex, Oedipus realizes his mistake, the fatal flaw of the Greek hero, and blinds himself by the end of the play. Macbeth realizes that his ambition is what bloodied his hands and has led to his demise. And you can rattle off the names of many other such tragic heroes. Willy Loman, unlike all these tragic heroes, does not realize his tragic flaw till the very end of the play. In fact, his tragic flaw sustains throughout the play. It is pervasive. He continuously shapes his past with superficial lies and builds a past for himself to suit his present and presents a picture of himself which would be suitable and presentable to his children and to his acquaintance. His failure to understand the present and the way it impinges or it will impinge on his future is precisely the real tragedy of the play. In fact, the manner in which Willy Loman becomes a tragic figure is not through self-realization. In his failure to acknowledge, Willy Loman becomes a tragic figure precisely in his failure to acknowledge that he has not lived up to the parameters that he has set for himself and his children. In a commercial world where Willy pays the ultimate price for giving up his life, Willy Loman becomes a tragic figure precisely in his failure to acknowledge that he has not lived up to the parameters that he has set for himself and his children. In a commercial world where Willy pays the ultimate price for giving up his life, Willy obtains or lives in a commercial world where he ultimately pays the price by giving up his life in order to live a life worth sustaining for his family. It is only befitting that in a world which does not value Willy Loman as a human, values his sacrifice in monetary terms. Next, we come to Biff Loman, Willy Loman's eldest son. He is constantly compared with Hercules, someone who is physically blessed, who is a physical specimen and who is meant to be successful and partake in the American dream. Biff, unlike Willy, acknowledges his failures and eventually manages to confront them. He not only confronts his own failures, but also that of his father's and that act of infidelity that Biff manages to find out about Willy. Willy sees Biff as an underachiever, while Biff sees himself as trapped in Willy's grandiose fantasies. For Willy, Biff is someone who's meant for greater things. He has impinged his expectations on Biff, who will turn into reality the dreams that Willy can only imagine. Unfortunately for him, Biff also turns out to be an underachiever who is not able to live up to the fantasies of the American dream. Biff's identity crisis is a function of his and his father's disillusionment, which, in order to reclaim his identity, he must expose. In fact, in some sense, Biff comes closer to that idea of a tragic figure. He does not lead himself to a tragic end, but at least leads himself to self realization, making himself aware of the fallacies of his father's propositions about life and also righting the wrongs that were done to him and his family. After Biff, we have Happy Loman, Willy Loman's second son. Happy Loman is a single dimensional character. He is not necessarily layered as much as that of Willy or Biff or his wife Linda. But Happy Loman is, in some sense, a mutated or a stunted incarnation of Willy's worst traits and the embodiment of the lies of the happy American dream. He is, in some sense, burdened by the expectations of his father and constantly lived under the shadow of his brother. In that sense, Happy identifies with Biff, but unlike Biff, he is burdened at two levels. Not only is he burdened by the expectations of his father, but he is burdened also by the shadow that constantly hangs over him of that of his brother. He shares Will's delusional tendencies. That is very clear when it comes to the lies that he tells about his occupation to his families when he is merely an assistant to that of the assistant. And yet, just like Willy, Happy Loman satisfies himself by constantly deluding others and himself with regards to the position that he holds in his society. Linda Loman, Willy's wife, is perhaps the most logical and the most rooted in reality among the four members of the family. For Linda, who has seen penury, who has seen the struggle of financial difficulties, freedom as an escape from debt is something which is more important to her. The ownership of material goods for her symbolizes success and stability. She is perhaps the representative of the disappointment that Willy Loman feels with himself, and at least the disappointment that Willy Loman thinks is perceived by everyone around him. Linda is the most rooted in reality of all the members of the family. She recognizes Willy's delusions for what they are and tries to correct them throughout the play, unfortunately failing till the very end. Now we will look at some of the larger themes that Arthur Miller uses in The Death of a Salesman. Death of a Salesman being set in the America of the 1940s and 50s deals with certain phenomena which were a result of the historical events that had taken place in the preceding decades, especially the First World War and the Second World War, and even the Great American Depression. All these historical events culminated or led to Arthur Miller writing Death of a Salesman, and the play, in some sense, signifies the accumulation of all the historical events that have taken place over the last century. The most important theme that Death of a Salesman covertly and overtly deals with is that of the American dream. The American dream which invited people from all over the world. The American dream which acted as a sense of an allure, as an alluring dream, as a lucrative proposal for people all over the world, especially those who were persecuted, who felt that they had no other option but to succeed. And the American dream preached itself or presented itself in front of others as that of a neutral entity, as something which provides every individual with an equal opportunity to success, irrespective of where they come from. It was an egalitarian dream that the American dream was sold as, something as egalitarian as the American Constitution itself. The problem, unfortunately, is that societal divisions and societal structures and economic structures are not necessarily constantly aligning themselves with that of the American dream. In fact, they more or less always become roadblocks in someone trying to achieve this particular American dream. Coming back to the play, Willy wholeheartedly believes in the idea of this American dream. He, being a salesman, has sold himself wholeheartedly and completely to the American dream and has embraced it with all his heart. But for Willy Loman, the idea of an American dream is in some sense distorted. His notion of what it means to be part of the American dream, of what it means to partake in the American dream, because for Willy Loman, succeeding in the American dream is equivalent to being nothing but being well liked and being personally attractive. Someone who has these traits, according to Willy Loman, can only but succeed. Now, these traits are nothing but superficial ideas about how a businessman or a salesman is supposed to present himself. These ideas ignore the larger, the grittier aspects of that what it takes to be successful in an American dream. The larger ideas of sheer grit, determination, and hard work is something that Willy Loman conveniently ignores. Oddly, his fixation with the superficial qualities of attractiveness are at odds with the realities, the dark realities of what it takes to succeed in America. Willy's interpretation is exactly in some sense aligned with his delusions of his own lives. His assessment of what it takes to succeed in America is as deluded as the ideas that he has about his own life. And therefore, it is not surprising that Willy Loman unfortunately never realizes his success in the American dream. After the American dream, the theme or the idea, the sentiment of abandonment is ubiquitous throughout the play. Willy suffers from the feeling of constantly being abandoned or the threat of being abandoned by his father and then eventually by his brother Ben. Initially, Willy was abandoned by his father, who did not leave anything for him in terms of for his financial upkeep. And later, Ben, who was in some sense the only father figure he had, also abandoned him in search, ironically, of an American dream. Willy, due to these two instances of being abandoned, was left with no formidable legacy, whether it was tangible or intangible. He had no property, he had no wealth, and he had no sense of history. Ben eventually departs for Alaska, where he ultimately achieves his American dream, hits the jackpot, and in some twisted stroke of luck, becomes a millionaire. Willy, on the other hand, continues to struggle. In some sense, the inability to leave, the inability to abandon others is precisely what thwarts, or in some sense acts as a roadblock in Willy Loman's road to success. Willy Loman's fear of abandonment is also precisely what shapes his ideas of how the American family should be. He is insistent on maintaining an image of the idyllic, ideal American family. An American family which is successful, an American family which is enjoying the material riches of America, and also an American family which is in some sense a cohesive single unit. Initially, Willy was abandoned by his father, who did not leave anything for him in terms of for his financial upkeep. And later, Ben, who was in some sense the only father figure he had, also abandoned him in search, ironically, of an American dream. Willy, due to these two instances of being abandoned, was left with no formidable legacy, whether it was tangible or intangible. He had no property, he had no wealth, and he had no sense of history. Ben eventually departs for Alaska, where he ultimately achieves his American dream, hits the jackpot, and in some twisted stroke of luck, becomes a millionaire. Willy, on the other hand, continues to struggle. In some sense, the inability to leave, the inability to abandon others is precisely what thwarts, or in some sense acts as a roadblock in Willy Loman's road to success. Willy Loman's fear of abandonment is also precisely what shapes his ideas of how the American family should be. He is insistent on maintaining an image of the idyllic, ideal American family. An American family which is successful, an American family which is enjoying the material riches of America, and also an American family which is in some sense a cohesive single unit. Willy considers the embodiment of promise and drops Willy Willie's zealous ambitions of maintaining that chimera of an American family are in some sense destroyed when he commits an act of infidelity, when he cheats on his wife. And that, in some sense, reveals the schizophrenic nature of Willie's principles. On one hand, he believes in the idea of family, and on the other, he goes out of his way to dismantle that very edifice which he was trying to build. Next, we come to the idea of betrayal. Willie's primary obsession throughout the play is what he considers to be Biff's betrayal and his ambitions for him. Billy, in some sense, suffers from the idea of being abandoned by his father, abandoned by his brother. At the same time, he has pinned his hopes and expectations on his children, both Biff and Happy. And therefore, when he realizes that Biff is unable to live up to the ideas, unable to live up to the standards that Willie has set for his children, Willie feels a sense of having been betrayed by his very son. And that betrayal is an extension of the abandonment that Willie felt at the hands of his father and his brother. Willie takes Biff's betrayal personally. He does not account, he does not blame it on Biff's inability. He does not blame it on Biff's incapability of being a success. In fact, he realizes, or he thinks, he perceives it as an insult. He thinks that Biff is doing it out of spite. Perhaps there is a truth to that element. Perhaps there is a truth in that suspicion. Because Biff is angry. Biff is, in some sense, deeply disappointed by Willie's betrayal, by Willie's dismantling of the very principles that Biff was reared on. For Willie, family was an important unit, and yet Willie's betrayal of Linda Lumen is what completely dismantles the image that Biff had about Willie. Willie's primary obsession throughout the play is what he considers to be Biff's betrayal and his ambitions for him. So far, we have looked at the themes in Death of a Salesman. Now we will look at the usage of symbolism in the play. Symbolism is the method that playwrights and artists use by using different symbols in order to portray a larger idea that the object or the symbol stands for. Seeds. Throughout the play, Willie Loman, in some sense, constantly attempts to sow seeds in his garden and grow vegetables. Now, his obsession with growing vegetables can be looked at and understood in various ways, through various interpretive lenses. His attempt to grow something is, in some sense, also an attempt to replicate his idea of constantly growing his riches, growing his income. His inability to provide for his family is also reflected in Willie's obsession with growing vegetables in his garden. His seed, in some sense, metaphorically refuses to grow, just like how his biological seeds, his children, his offsprings, Biff and Happy, both turn out to be failures. What he expects from the garden does not turn out to be true, and that is symptomatic, almost a mirror reflection of what happens in his real life garden as well. His family does not grow, his children refuse to blossom, and that is exactly what happens in Willie's garden as well. He, in some sense, fails as a gardener and also fails in a larger metaphoric sense as a father figure, as that of a man who has failed to provide for his family. Willie Loman is not only a failure in the economic sense of the American dream, he is also a social failure because he fails to keep his family together. He fails to keep his family prosperous. The second symbol that is constantly used is that of diamonds. Diamonds represent the material prosperity, the affluence that America has to offer to everyone who's willing to partake in it, who's willing to work hard for it. Unfortunately for Willie, his hard work, or at least his attempts at hard work, do not yield to any diamonds of any sort for him. Ben, whose abandonment led to Ben's discovery of diamonds in Alaska, is almost a figure which stands in stark contrast to that of Willie Loman the salesman. Ben, his brother, becomes a symbol of success, while Willy Loman becomes a mirror reflection or a diametrically opposite figure of that of a failed salesman. The diamonds that were written in the fortune of Ben refuse to find themselves in the fortune of Willy Loman, the salesman. Despite his unwavering belief in the American dream, Willy Loman simply refuses to take action. Willy Loman, despite having been offered a job by his neighbor, does not take it because he has an inflated sense of the place that he has in a society. At the very end of the play, Willy Loman finds those diamonds in the most tragic and perhaps in the most pathetic way that any individual could. Willy Loman, on the advice of Ben, the delusional figure, the hallucinating figure that Willy is talking to, enters the dark jungle to find the diamonds, which is Willy's attempts to enter the dark jungle being the metaphorical idea of death. Willy Loman is willing to commit himself to kill himself so that his family has a better life. He ultimately commits suicide, that is, enters the dark jungle in order for his children, his family, to have that elusive diamond, that insurance money which will perhaps help his family to sustain themselves after his death. And lastly, we have Linda and the woman's stockings. Linda is representative of the faithful wife who is somehow an important member of the American dream and yet is not an economic participant yet. Willy's strange obsession with the condition of Linda's stockings foreshadows his later flashbacks to the discovery of his infidelity. His worry is at two levels. On one, it is the literal idea that eats him up, the idea that he is unable to provide Linda with new clothing. He is unable to provide for his family, and Linda's stockings are constant reminders of Willy's failure as a provider, of Willy's failure as a man who is supposed to keep his family intact. The stockings also assume a certain metaphorical myth, a metaphorical weight. The stockings also become representative of Willy's betrayal, of Willy's infidelity towards Linda. His grand ideas about the American family are nothing but hogwash. His grand ideas about the American family are nothing but a cover for the act of infidelity that he puts Linda through. And therefore, the Linda's stocking constantly become grim reminders of Willy's failure on both these counts. The rubber hose is another symbol that is constantly used by Arthur Miller. It has grim connotations because the rubber hose was used by Willy to inhale gas, which is a reminder to the audience that Willy had even before attempted to commit suicide out of desperation. It is one of the most basic elements with which he must equip his home for his family's health and comfort. So it has a dual nature. On one end, Willy used it to kill himself, to annihilate himself so that his family could have a better life and he could rid himself from the troubles that he has to constantly face. While at the same time, the gas is also important to keep his family warm from the cold, bitter winter of America. It also, in some sense, can take life while simultaneously sustaining it. The literal death that Willy would have suffered from inhaling gas is also in some sense an attempt to finally provide his family with some sense of succor. Now that we have looked at the themes and the symbols that were used in The Death of a Salesman, we finally come to certain motifs that are used in this play. The mythic figures that are constantly alluded to in the play are also in some sense motifs that are used by Miller for larger purposes. Willy has a tendency to constantly mythologize the people around him. For example, he constantly compares his sons, Biff and Happy, to mythic Greek figures like that of Adonis and Hercules, because he believes that his sons are the epitomes, are the virtual examples of the masculine figure, and also being well liked. The two qualities that, according to Willy, are the most important to become successful in the American dream. Willy's tendency to mythologize unfortunately proves quite short-sighted, because Willie doesn't realize that his attempt to mythologize the figures that he used to is nothing but, in some sense, a cover for the failures, for the diminutive figures that they are. The figures of Biff and Happy are failures in their lives. They're adults who have failed to make anything of their lives, to have failed to become independent, and the constant comparisons of those figures with godlike figures is an attempt by Willie to elevate their status in his own mind. Finally, the American West, Alaska, and the African jungle, these territorial regions become metaphorical representatives. These regions become representative of the potential the potential of instinct of Biff and Willie. Willie's father found success in Alaska and his brother Ben became rich in Africa. These exotic locales, especially when compared to Willie's banal Brooklyn existence, is in some sense crystallizing or ossifying or representing the contrast of the exotic locales of Alaska and Africa, in some sense, starkly contrast that of Willie's plain, simple, and banal neighborhood in Brooklyn. Those stand in contrast with Willie's grotesque obsession with the commercial world of the city, which has trapped him in an unpleasant circle. Alaska and the African jungle symbolize Willie's refusal to seek adventure, Willie's refusal to move out, Willie's refusal to move out of his comfort zone and seek success. They also become stark reminders of the successes of his parents, the successes of his brother, and also the reminder of his own failure. Biff eventually leaves the eastern side, and his westward escape is in some sense reflective of his refusal, his abandonment of the ideas that Willie constantly sold to him, and also refusal to enter into the commercial trap that the American dream has been selling to him since a very young age. It is an embrace of the importance of the individual and not the machinery which exploits the individual. Thank you for being in today's class. In the next lecture, we will look at the summary of the play and analyze each section of the play in detail. Thank you.